Okay, let me move to early developments of tests, as I said, beginning around the 1850s to 1950s. As I've talked about, to some extent this was influenced by Darwin's work, followed by his cousin Francis Galton, also Francis Galton's work, which was sort of tied to this sort of view of a Darwinian sort of a view of eugenics, which unfortunately manifested itself in Nazism, but in some sense it sort of persisted. I think, unfortunately, I think it still persists to some extent today, where people actually think there is a correlation between intelligence and economic class. There might be in terms of the way intelligence is measured in a fashion that I think is actually pretty biased towards certain privileged Western white stream cultures. But in the earliest developments, I think testing really emerged in conjunction with conceptualizations of intelligence, which were further by two Frenchmen's work, Binet and Terman, who I think was in the early 1900s, developed the first intelligence test, the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, which is still the mainstay used in education, in school psychology, in schools today to measure intelligence. An individual test which sampled from some of the developments coming out of psychology, and if you remember, I've talked at length about this, the extent to which psychology was trying to be a science, was focusing on things that were measurable, observable, quite behavioristic, and so in terms of testing, we're looking for items that would actually try to give a measure of reasoning and mental sort of processing. In reading, this emphasis, this sort of positivistic sort of emphasis, manifested itself in terms of also the first reading test that a gentleman by the name of William S. Gray is reputed to have been involved in developing, which was tied to observable reading behavior, which was largely oral reading. And some other tests were developed which also focused upon reading rate, and sometimes forms of comprehension which might be tied to retellings or answers to questions. And so in this early 1900s, you had the beginnings of the development of testing. Hand in hand with this was obviously tests related to educational advancement, and with the growth of universal education, you started to sort of see some other forms of testing for purposes of entrance exam. And again, the social picture or the social lens applied to entrance exams for university suggests quite a problematic sort of history, that if some scholars would contend and have relatively strong evidence to suggest that the first screening advices for college entrance, particularly in the early 1900s, was to see if in fact they could discriminate against the large number of, for example, Jewish students getting into universities. And so this sort of this profiling, but using tests as a form of profiling of exclusion was occurring right from the get-go. A person whose work I've mentioned that was integrally involved in this, particularly in his early work in comprehension, was E.L. Thorndike, who, if you recall, was considered the father of educational psychology. And he was very much interested in developing reading comprehension tests. which took the form typically of a test of vocabulary or word meaning and responses to short passages. As this work sort of unfolded into the early 1900s, and particularly in the 1920s, you saw other influences coming into play in the testing work. The work of Jean Piaget, which was very much tied to a sort of a developmental orientation, was quite significant, as was the work of a number of developmental psychologists, Arthur Geisel and Jürgen Ames, based upon their observations of people, were suggesting things called gradients, developmental sequences that people went through, and were suggesting what were the criteria by which one could judge whether or not one was developing over time in terms of their intellectual abilities. There was a sort of a concept of Piaget, which was a sort of an unfolding concept that was later challenged, I think, particularly with the cognitive work of people like Jerome Bruner. But at this point in time, there was very much this sort of developmental stage-wise orientation, and which led to a corollary development by a psychologist and reading educator, Arthur Gates. In about 1927, you saw the first development of the reading readiness test. And those tests were to do with auditory discrimination, visual discrimination, child's knowledge of letter names or alphabet. And what becomes interesting as you look at these sort of developments and the readiness tests and what they were measuring, and the other tests of development. And one other major thing in terms of reading, there was a sort of a feeling that a lot of these tests weren't necessarily as closely connected to curriculum, and weren't therefore necessarily an effective way to measure the effectiveness of schools, that we actually saw in the 1930s the first standardized reading test, which for most students involved large-scale assessments tied to the Thorndike-like model of being suggested of a test of vocabulary using short passages. What's important to note as you look at these developments is that while the standardized reading tests had some orientation to the curriculum and what was being taught, they were standardized from the perspective of being norm referenced. And the concept of norm reference is important to understand, is that what they were interested in is tests that compared students with other students. And so the norms that were developed were based upon testing a lot of students and getting a sense of how their scores might distribute, so that one could, if in one person got a score in a test that might place them here, one had a sense of how that person was compared with other people in the population. And so these tests weren't tied to whether or not a person had mastered reading. They were really tied to a comparative sense. Again, sort of befitting the Galton sort of sense of how do we differentiate and how do we identify the kids who will be very successful and should be given access and opportunities versus students who might need other forms of education. And you can start to sort of see how these things can sort of play out in terms of educational programs, where these tests could be used to stream kids. Indeed, I remember at an early age in the 50s of being placed in a certain stream and certain of my friends being placed in another stream. And those streams stayed in place pretty well for one's entire educational experience through elementary school and through high school. So streaming was one impact. But also there's impact on curriculum. In the 1930s, when they developed the first test based upon, standardized tests based upon reading curriculum, a comment that was being made, well, we expect this test will change as curriculum changes over time. What they didn't count on was the extent to which these tests themselves begin to define curriculum. Because schools and educators were concerned how students would do on these tests, rather than a set of tests that hadn't been developed that might reflect changes in curriculum. So there became a sort of a insipid, I'm not sure how I describe it, a relationship between where tests were developed from curriculum, but then tests became the key determiner of what was being taught. Indeed, what was being theorized. And so if you look at reading programs, you would see that a heavy emphasis has been, since the 1930s and persists, teaching vocabulary and doing comprehension by providing kids reading selections and questions. And if you look at the reading readiness stuff, you'll find that what are kids taught? They're taught letter names and the alphabet and auditory discrimination and visual discrimination. So the test became the deciding factor in terms of what was taught, and led to not only streaming, but a certain scope, a certain protocol relative to teaching reading, and also over time to a certain scope and sequence of what was taught when in schools. But as you're aware, and where I sort of begin talking extensively about developments in reading, in the 1950s, we had the occurrence of Sputnik, and everybody was very concerned about the West falling behind the Soviet in particular, and that what we really needed to upgrade our schools and make sure we're doing a better job of teaching students. And then, so all of a sudden in the 1950s, we had a shift to an approach to testing, particularly focused on testing reading, which was much more pedagogically anchored. I'll talk about that next.